Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're about to dive into literally one of the most powerful concepts in all of macroeconomics. Have you ever wondered how governments actually keep nations from just driving straight off a financial cliff? Well, it turns out they use an economic steering wheel. Today, we're going to explore the mechanics of how governments navigate the constant ups and downs of the economic cycle and basically steer us all away from ruin and toward stability. Let's get into it.
So it's a pretty massive question, right? How exactly does the government control the economy? I mean, when things are overheating into a wild boom or crashing into a devastating bust, they can't just sit back and watch the show. They have to step in. But what actual tools do they have in their toolkit to reach in and literally change the financial reality for millions of people and businesses?
Okay, let's dive right into this with Section 1. What is fiscal policy?
Well, that mechanism is called fiscal policy. By definition, fiscal policy is basically the use of government spending and taxation to influence the level of aggregate demand in the economy. Now, I know aggregate demand sounds like a bit of heavy jargon, but it really just means the total demand for all goods and services. We're talking about everything from the coffee you bought this morning to the steel used to build massive skyscrapers, all at a given time. By adjusting their own spending and, of course, the taxes they collect from us, the government directly impacts how much money is flowing around and how much total demand actually exists out there.
Moving right along to Section 2, the two policy levers.
To make this happen, the government effectively stands in front of this giant control panel with two massive policy levers, taxes and government spending. On one side, the government pulls the tax lever. They tax people on their income, or they tax businesses on their profits, all to build up tax revenue. They can even introduce entirely new taxes just to shift your behavior. Think of that pesky 5p tax on plastic bags you always forget to bring to the grocery store. Now, on the other side, that tax revenue actually funds the second lever, which is government spending. This is the cash poured into public services like healthcare and education. And hey, if they want to increase spending way beyond what those taxes actually cover, they have to borrow. So you can see how these two levers are just deeply, deeply interlinked.
Now let's look at exactly how a government pulls this tax lever in practice. Let's say things are running a bit too hot. A government might look at the situation and decide that a 20% tax rate just isn't enough, so they hike it way up to 35%. Why? To cool down consumer spending. Or, on the flip side, if the economy is sluggish and struggling, they might take a 40% tax rate and drop it all the way down to 25%. That puts a chunk of money directly back into the pockets of everyday consumers to encourage us all to go out and buy things again.
And the real beauty of this system is its absolute flexibility. Governments are never just locked into pulling a single lever. Depending on the economic climate at the time, they can change taxes, they can change government spending, or, if they really need to, they can aggressively pull both levers at the exact same time to rapidly heat up or cool down the whole nation's economy.
Which brings us to Section 3, Keynes and the Great Depression.
To really get a grip on this, we got to take a quick trip back in time. Looking at this timeline, you can see how economic policy goes through these really distinct eras. It all kind of started back in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when the global economy was just in an absolute downward spiral. The ideas that were born out of that crisis actually led to incredible recoveries later on in the 50s and 60s. But interestingly enough, by the time we hit the 1970s and 80s, these fiscal policies fell a bit out of favor. Governments started shifting their preference over to monetary policy, doing things like adjusting interest rates instead. But, as we're going to see, a massive shock in 2007 and 2008 brought fiscal policy roaring right back to center stage.
So who came up with this? Well, the architect of this whole approach was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was what we call a fiscalist, and he radically changed macroeconomic theory by arguing that during a depression or a recession, when the economic cycle is just completely tanking, the government absolutely must intervene. No sitting on the sidelines. He believed the government had to step in, increase its own spending, and artificially stimulate the economy to essentially pull it back up by its bootstraps. And you know what? It worked. His ideas successfully stabilized post-war economies for decades.
Next up is Section 4, Surviving the Financial Crisis.
And this brilliantly illustrates how much our economic understanding has evolved over time. Think about the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis. It was actually deeper than the Great Depression in terms of global GDP falling. The drop was way larger. But look at the difference in recovery times. The Great Depression took literally decades to come back from. But following the 2008 crisis, because governments actually understood how to actively use macroeconomic policy, economies bounced back to their pre-crisis performance levels in just about 10 years. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a long, incredibly painful process for sure, but improved policy healed that massive economic wound dramatically faster.
So what specific fiscal levers did they actually pull during that 2008 crisis? Well, governments intervened frantically, and I mean heavily. First, they increased spending on benefits to help out people who were suddenly facing unemployment. Then, they slashed taxes, dropping the value-added tax down from 20% and slowly raising the personal allowance threshold for income tax. They also executed massive, sweeping bank bailouts. They even stepped in to fix petrol prices. They were pulling out all the stops.
Out of all of those, the bank bailouts were perhaps the most dramatic form of government spending. I mean, we are talking about astronomical amounts of money here. But it was entirely necessary. These banks were financially vital institutions. If the government hadn't stepped in and spent that cash, those banks would have collapsed. And that would have absolutely crippled the entire financial industry nationwide, and honestly caused a total economic meltdown.
Now, let's walk through how this builds into a really fascinating chain reaction using just one specific intervention, fixing petrol prices. Think about it. When the government steps in and fixes or lowers the price of petrol, it directly reduces the operating costs for firms that are out there producing goods. And because it's suddenly cheaper to produce stuff, those firms can increase their supply. This higher supply then puts this nice downward pressure on prices across the market. And what happens when things are cheaper? Consumers go out and buy more. All of this ultimately boosts the entire nation's GDP. It's just a brilliant example of a highly targeted fiscal lever hard at work.
This leads us to our final section, Section 5, 3 Functions of Fiscal Policy. Ultimately, there are 3 main goals to pulling all these levers. The first core function is stimulating economic growth. This is exactly what Keynes was arguing for, right? By increasing government spending, they boost that aggregate demand and drive growth right in the middle of a recession. The second function is keeping inflation low and manageable. And finally, the third is stabilizing the overall economy to avoid those really wild, stomach-churning fluctuations.
Let's zoom in on that second function for a second, inflation. In the UK, for instance, they have this target inflation rate of 2%. Now, while the Bank of England usually handles this side of things, the government's fiscal policy still plays a massive role. If inflation starts creeping up past that 2% mark, the government can hike up tax rates or cut their own spending. This causes overall consumption and aggregate demand to drop, which effectively pulls those rising prices right back down. Basically, it keeps your weekly grocery bill from completely spiraling out of control.
So the crucial point here really comes down to this third function, stabilization. You might see a news headline celebrating that the economy is growing at a massive 8.5%. And on the surface, that sounds like a fantastic news story, right? But actually, an economy doesn't necessarily want that. Why? Because extreme booms make things highly, highly variable. And in economics, extreme booms are almost always followed by extreme, incredibly painful busts.
What governments and economists actually want to see is a much more boring number, usually between 1.5% to 2%. They really aren't looking for a roller coaster ride here. They want a very stable, smooth trending growth rate. That steady 1.5% to 2%, that is the ultimate sign of a healthy, well-steered economy. Which brings us to the ultimate question for you to chew on as you watch the news today. Does your economy feel like a smooth trend right now or a volatile roller coaster? Next time you see the government announce a brand new tax cut or some massive spending package, you'll know exactly which lever they're pulling and why they're frantically trying to steer the wheel. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on those policy levers.